What happens when an election is held, but fear, silence, and force speak louder than the ballot? What happens when a longtime security partner of the West claims victory at the polls while the streets fill with tear gas and the internet goes dark? In the days following Uganda's highly contested presidential election, the United States broke its usual diplomatic tone and issued a clear warning. Washington expressed deep concern over reports of voter intimidation, media restrictions, violent crackdowns, and an electoral process many critics say lacked transparency from the start. For Americans who have watched decades of global elections, this moment feels uncomfortably familiar and deeply troubling. Uganda's election, held on January 15, 2026, was not just another national vote. It was a test of credibility, a test of civil liberties, and a test of whether democratic norms still matter when stability and security are at stake. The government declared that President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, in power since 1986, had secured another term with an overwhelming majority. But the opposition rejected those results outright, calling them fraudulent and imposed through fear. As ballots were being counted, the country experienced an internet shutdown, heavy military deployments in major cities, and violent clashes between security forces and civilians. Opposition leader Robert Kyagulanyi Bobi Wine reported raids near his home and described an environment where dissent itself appeared criminalized. Human rights organizations and international observers echoed those concerns, warning that such conditions undermine public trust and threaten long-term stability. For Americans, this raises a difficult but necessary question. Can an election be considered legitimate when citizens are silenced, journalists are restricted, and fear replaces free choice? And when such elections occur in allied nations, what responsibility does the international community truly have? Tonight, we take a closer look at why the U.S. warning matters, what is happening on the ground in Uganda, and why this moment could shape not only Uganda's future, but the democratic standards of an entire region. If you believe election integrity matters everywhere, not just at home, please share this video and subscribe if you believe the truth should come before political convenience. The warning issued by the United States did not emerge in a vacuum. It came after a chain of events in Uganda that, taken together, raised serious questions about whether the 2026 presidential election met even the most basic standards of transparency and fairness. Ugandans went to the polls on January 15, 2026, in what authorities described as a routine democratic exercise. But on the ground, the atmosphere was anything but routine. In the days leading up to the vote, security forces were deployed across major cities and opposition strongholds. Military vehicles appeared on key roads. Police checkpoints multiplied. For many voters, the presence of armed personnel near polling areas was not reassuring, it was intimidating. Then came the most controversial decision of the election period, a nationwide internet shutdown. Acting under directives from the Uganda Communications Commission, authorities cut access to social media platforms, messaging apps, and most online services 2 days before voting began. Officials claimed the blackout was necessary to prevent misinformation and maintain public order. Critics, however, saw it as a deliberate attempt to control information at the most critical moment of the democratic process. For voters, journalists, and election observers, the blackout had immediate consequences. Independent reporting became nearly impossible. Citizens could not share photos or videos from polling stations. Opposition parties were cut off from communicating with supporters. In effect, the country entered Election Day in a state of digital silence, one that sharply contrasted with modern democratic norms. Despite these conditions, voting proceeded. Hours later, Uganda's Electoral Commission announced preliminary results showing President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni securing another term with approximately 71 to 72% of the vote. Museveni, who has ruled Uganda since 1986, framed the outcome as a clear mandate from the people. State media echoed that message, presenting the election as peaceful and decisive. The opposition told a very different story. Robert Kyagulanyi, widely known as Robert Kyagulanyi Bobi Wine, immediately rejected the results. He accused the government of widespread irregularities, including ballot stuffing, voter intimidation, and harassment of opposition polling agents. According to his campaign, some agents were blocked from accessing polling centers, while others were detained or forced to flee. As counting continued, tensions escalated. Reports emerged of clashes between civilians and security forces in several urban areas. Tear gas was deployed against demonstrators. Gunfire was reported during protests following the provisional results. Although official casualty figures remained disputed, multiple accounts confirmed deaths, injuries, and mass arrests. These developments prompted swift reactions from international actors. The U.S. Embassy in Kampala issued a security advisory urging American citizens to exercise caution, citing post-election unrest, the use of force against protesters, and an unpredictable security environment. Soon after, the U.S. State Department released a statement expressing deep concern over reports of voter suppression, media restrictions, and violence. The message from Washington was measured but unmistakable. U.S. officials emphasized that intimidation and the suppression of voters undermine public trust. They stressed that respect for human rights, freedom of the press, and the rule of law are essential components of any credible election. Transparent vote counting, they warned, is not optional, it is foundational. For many observers, the significance of these events goes beyond Uganda itself. When elections are conducted under conditions of fear, silence, and force, the question is no longer who won, but whether the process can be trusted at all. And once that trust is broken, restoring it becomes far more difficult than winning any single vote. As Uganda's disputed election moved from counting rooms to the streets, the situation rapidly escalated from political tension to national crisis. What began as allegations of irregularities soon became scenes of confrontation, fear, and force, images that would shape global perception far more than any official result. In the hours following the announcement of provisional results, security forces tightened their grip on major urban centers. Armored vehicles were positioned near key intersections. Riot police moved into neighborhoods known to support the opposition. Demonstrations, some spontaneous, others organized, were met with tear gas, batons, and in several reported cases, live ammunition. For many Ugandans, the message was unmistakable: dissent would not be tolerated. At the center of this storm stood opposition leader Robert Kyagulanyi, Bobi Wine. His campaign reported that security forces attempted to raid his residence while votes were still being counted. According to his team, Bobi Wine narrowly escaped detention while members of his family were effectively placed under de facto house arrest. Police denied formally detaining him, but confirmed a heavy security presence near his home, an explanation that did little to reassure supporters. These events transformed Bobi Wine from a political challenger into a symbol of a broader struggle. Supporters viewed the pressure against him as proof that the electoral process was being enforced by force rather than consent. Critics of the government argued that when an opposition candidate cannot move freely, speak openly, or challenge results without fear, elections lose their democratic meaning. Human rights organizations quickly documented what was unfolding. Amnesty International reported multiple instances of excessive force used against peaceful crowds, including tear gas, batons, and pepper spray. The organization also cited arbitrary arrests of suspected opposition supporters, roadblocks restricting movement, and the use of military vehicles to obstruct campaign and post-election activities. International concern deepened as reports accumulated. The United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights issued warnings about arbitrary detentions, enforced disappearances of activists, and violent dispersal of gatherings. Such actions, the UN cautioned, risked violating fundamental rights and casting serious doubt on the legitimacy of the electoral process itself. Compounding the crisis was the silencing of independent oversight. Just days before the vote, the Ugandan government ordered several local civil society groups to halt operations, including organizations that had historically monitored elections and documented abuses. Media outlets faced restrictions ranging from intimidation to limited movement. Journalists reported being blocked from covering protests and polling-related developments, further narrowing the flow of reliable information. These measures did more than restrict coverage; they amplified suspicion. Without independent observers, without open media, and without free digital communication, competing narratives filled the vacuum. State authorities described the situation as under control. Opposition voices described a nation under siege. For citizens and international observers alike, verifying the truth became increasingly difficult. The reaction from democratic watchdogs reflected a familiar pattern. Freedom House, which had already warned of declining electoral credibility in Uganda, reiterated concerns that elections there occur regularly but lack genuine competitiveness and institutional independence. Similar criticisms had followed previous elections, reinforcing the perception that 2026 was not an isolated incident but part of a long-term trend. By this stage, the crisis had moved beyond vote counts and percentages. The real issue was legitimacy. When elections are accompanied by violent censorship and fear, they cease to function as instruments of public choice. Instead, they become flashpoints, revealing how power is maintained, not how it is earned. And once that line is crossed, restoring trust is no longer a matter of recounts or statements. It becomes a question of whether a society can believe in its political future at all. When the tear gas cleared and the streets grew quieter, Uganda was left facing consequences far deeper than disputed vote totals. The aftermath of the 2026 election revealed fractures within society and the political system, fractures that cannot be repaired by declarations of victory alone. For ordinary Ugandans, the most immediate impact was fear. In neighborhoods that had witnessed clashes between citizens and security forces, daily life slowed to a cautious routine. Families limited movement. Businesses closed early. Parents worried about sending their children to school. The presence of soldiers and police, once framed as a guarantee of stability, increasingly felt like a reminder of how quickly civic space could shrink. Civil liberties suffered visibly. Public gatherings were restricted. Roadblocks disrupted movement between towns. Activists and opposition supporters reported arbitrary arrests, often without clear charges. These actions created a chilling effect, discouraging citizens from participating in political discussions or peaceful demonstrations. When political engagement becomes risky, silence replaces participation and democracy weakens quietly. The political consequences were equally significant. President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni's victory, though officially declared, entered history under a cloud of legitimacy concerns. Years earlier, constitutional changes had removed age and term limits, allowing Museveni to extend his rule indefinitely. Critics argue that the 2026 election further entrenched this concentration of power, reinforcing a system where political continuity depends less on public consent and more on institutional control. For the opposition, the election marked another setback but also a turning point. Robert Kyagulanyi, Bobi Wine, and his supporters faced an environment where contesting results came at personal and organizational cost. Offices were disrupted, communications limited, and leadership placed under constant surveillance. Yet, the persistence of opposition voices despite these pressures underscored a deeper demand for political change that could not be easily erased. Uganda's youthful population adds a critical dimension to these consequences. With a large share of citizens under the age of 30, expectations for opportunity, accountability, and representation remain high. When elections are perceived as closed or unfair, frustration among young voters grows. Some withdraw from formal politics altogether. Others turn to protest, increasing the risk of future unrest. Neither outcome supports long-term stability. Institutionally, trust suffered severe damage. Electoral bodies, law enforcement agencies, and the judiciary all faced heightened skepticism. When citizens doubt the neutrality of institutions meant to protect their rights, the social contract weakens. Restoring that trust requires more than reforms on paper. It requires visible accountability and restraint, especially from those who wield power. Internationally, the political consequences began to ripple outward. Uganda has long positioned itself as a stabilizing force in East Africa, contributing troops to peacekeeping missions and cooperating closely with Western partners on security initiatives. Persistent allegations of democratic backsliding, however, risk complicating those relationships. Aid, partnerships, diplomatic engagement, and security cooperation all depend to varying degrees on shared values and credibility. Ultimately, the 2026 election left Uganda at a crossroads. One path leads toward deeper entrenchment of authority, managed stability, and shrinking civic space. The other requires confronting uncomfortable truths about governance, accountability, and the will of the people. Which path prevails will shape not only Uganda's political future, but the everyday lives of millions who call the country home. From Washington's perspective, Uganda's contested election presents a familiar dilemma, one that has defined U.S. foreign policy for decades. How does the United States balance strategic security interests with its stated commitment to democratic norms and human rights? Uganda occupies a critical position in East Africa's security architecture. It has long been a key contributor to regional peacekeeping efforts, particularly in Somalia, and a central partner in counterterrorism operations. For U.S. policymakers, Kampala has often been viewed as a reliable ally in a volatile region. That relationship, however, has increasingly come under strain as concerns over governance and civil liberties deepen. Following the 2026 election, the U.S. State Department and the U.S. Embassy in Kampala issued carefully worded but firm statements. They emphasized the need for election credibility, respect for human rights, freedom of the press, and transparent vote counting. The message was not merely symbolic. It signaled growing discomfort with practices that undermine public trust and risk long-term instability. For American officials, the stakes are practical as well as moral. Elections perceived as illegitimate can weaken partner governments, fuel unrest, and create openings for extremist groups to exploit grievances. Stability built on repression may appear effective in the short term, but history has shown it to be fragile. In this sense, democratic integrity is not a luxury. It is a component of sustainable security. Beyond Washington, global reactions echoed similar concerns. International human rights organizations and democratic watchdogs framed Uganda's election as part of a broader pattern of democratic backsliding across parts of Africa. Regular elections, they argued, lose meaning. When opposition voices are constrained, media is restricted, and civic space is narrowed. Such conditions erode the very legitimacy elections are meant to provide. Multilateral institutions face their own challenges. Bodies like the African Union and regional blocs are often cautious in responding to member states' internal affairs, prioritizing sovereignty and stability. Yet, silence carries its own costs. When electoral controversies go unaddressed, they risk setting precedents, signaling that the use of force and censorship can coexist with claims of democratic legitimacy. For Western partners, including the United States and European allies, Uganda's situation raises difficult questions about engagement. Should security cooperation continue unchanged? Should aid be conditioned on governance reforms, or does public pressure risk pushing strategic partners away, potentially toward alternative alliances less concerned with democratic standards? These questions resonate beyond Uganda's borders. East Africa is home to a young, rapidly growing population watching how power is exercised and challenged. When democratic processes appear hollow, cynicism spreads not only toward national governments, but toward the international actors who engage with them. Ultimately, the global response to Uganda's election reflects a broader crossroads in international politics. The choice is not between stability and democracy, but between short-term order and long-term legitimacy. How the United States and the wider international community navigate this balance will shape not only their credibility abroad, but the political trajectories of countries grappling with the future of democratic governance. Uganda's disputed 2026 election is more than a single political episode. It is a warning, one that reaches far beyond national borders and speaks to a growing global challenge. When elections are conducted under fierce censorship and force, their outcomes may be announced, but their legitimacy remains deeply in question. For Ugandans, the consequences are immediate and personal. Confidence in political institutions has been shaken. Civil liberties have been tested. For many citizens, especially the young, faith in the ballot box now competes with frustration and disillusionment. When people stop believing that their voices matter, societies drift towards silence or confrontation. Neither path leads to lasting peace. For the region, the stakes are equally high. Uganda has long been a cornerstone of stability in East Africa, contributing troops to peacekeeping missions and serving as a strategic partner in counterterrorism efforts. A fragile political environment at home, however, risks spilling outward. Political unrest, contested legitimacy, and generational anger do not respect borders. History shows that instability in one country can echo across an entire region. For international partners, including the United States, this moment demands honesty. Advocating for democratic norms cannot be selective. When concerns over election integrity, media freedom, and human rights are raised, they must be followed by consistent engagement, not silence once headlines fade. Stability built without accountability is temporary. Legitimacy once lost is difficult to restore. This election also raises a broader question for the world. What do we truly mean by democracy in the modern era? Is it merely the act of voting, or the conditions under which citizens are allowed to choose freely? When internet shutdowns, intimidation, and violence become tools of political management, elections risk becoming symbols rather than expressions of public will. Uganda now stands at a crossroads. One path leads toward deeper consolidation of power and shrinking civic space. The other requires reflection, reform, and a willingness to listen to opposition voices, civil society, and an increasingly young population demanding dignity and opportunity. The direction chosen will shape the nation's future for years to come. For viewers watching from abroad, this story is not distant. It speaks to universal principles of fairness, accountability, and human dignity. Democratic values lose meaning if they are defended only when convenient. If you believe that elections should be more than ceremonies, if you believe they should reflect the genuine will of the people, please share this video. And subscribe if you believe that truth, transparency, and human rights must come before political comfort. The conversation does not end here. It begins with awareness and continues with voices that refuse to be silenced.